Picture this. You're in ancient Alexandria. The year is 48 BC, and you're witnessing something that would make even the Romans blush. The most powerful woman in the world is hosting what she calls her selection ceremonies. Elaborate feasts where young men from across the Mediterranean compete not for gold or glory, but for one night in the queen's private chambers. What I'm about to tell you about Cleopatra's romantic obsessions sounds impossible, but every detail comes from ancient historians who documented her shocking pleasures. We're talking about practices so scandalous that Roman senators wrote secret letters about them, practices that made even Julius Caesar himself uncomfortable. If you're fascinated by the untold secrets of history's most seductive ruler, hit that like button right now, because this story gets wilder than anything Hollywood ever dared to show. And stick around until the end, because I'll reveal the one romantic practice that even made Caesar himself leave Alexandria in disgust, and the secret chamber where Cleopatra kept her most prized possessions, her collection of young lovers. Tell me in the comments, did you know about Cleopatra's true romantic preferences? Have you ever heard about her Garden of Adonis? Everyone thinks they know Cleopatra, the beautiful Egyptian queen who seduced Julius Caesar and Mark Antony to save her kingdom. But here's what your history books never told you. Cleopatra VII wasn't just interested in powerful older men for political gain. According to ancient sources like Plutarch, Dio Cassius, and recently discovered papyrus fragments, the last pharaoh of Egypt had a particular fascination that scandalized even the morally flexible Romans. Cleopatra ruled Egypt from 51 to 30 BC, commanding the richest kingdom in the Mediterranean. She spoke 9 languages fluently, was educated in mathematics, philosophy, rhetoric, and astronomy at the legendary Library of Alexandria. She was brilliant, calculating, and utterly ruthless when it came to maintaining power. But beneath this intellectual facade and political cunning lay desires and obsessions that would define her reign and ultimately contribute to her dramatic downfall. The queen wasn't just the richest woman in the world. She controlled the grain supply that fed Rome itself. Her palace in Alexandria was said to rival the gods' dwellings in luxury, with rooms made entirely of gold and silver, gardens that bloomed year-round through mysterious Egyptian magic, and chambers filled with treasures from across the known world. But the most secretive and scandalous part of her palace was a wing that no Roman was ever supposed to see. The Roman historian Dio Cassius wrote extensively about Cleopatra's unconventional romantic arrangements that began shortly after she secured her throne at age 18. Unlike other royal women who married for political alliances and bore heirs dutifully, Cleopatra seemed to view romance as both exquisite pleasure and devastating political weapon. Ancient sources describe elaborate banquets she hosted specifically for young men who had recently transitioned to manhood. These weren't ordinary dinner parties or political gatherings. Guests would arrive at sunset to find the palace completely transformed, floors covered in rose petals imported from Damascus, 3 feet deep, walls draped in the finest Chinese silks that cost more than a Roman villa, and golden couches arranged in intimate circles around bubbling fountains filled with wine instead of water. The air would be thick with incense made from frankincense, myrrh, and secret Egyptian herbs that supposedly heightened desire and lowered inhibitions. Musicians played hypnotic melodies on instruments made from precious metals, while dancers performed ancient fertility rituals that had been practiced since the time of the pharaohs. But here's where it gets truly fascinating. These young men weren't chosen for their wealth, family connections, or political influence. Cleopatra's selection criteria were purely based on physical beauty, intellectual capacity, and what ancient sources describe as the fire of youth. She preferred those who could engage her brilliant mind in philosophical debates, while also satisfying her very specific and demanding romantic tastes. Plutarch mentions her collection of beautiful youths, who served various roles throughout her court. Some were appointed as personal advisors and accompanied her to important meetings. Others served as ceremonial guards during religious festivals, and still others worked as scribes copying important documents. But all shared one unmistakable trait. They had recently celebrated their transition from boyhood to manhood, representing that perfect combination of youthful energy and mature capabilities that utterly captivated the queen. Can you imagine the fierce competition among noble families across the empire to have their sons selected for these exclusive gatherings? Fathers would spend fortunes on tutors, physical trainers, and even cosmetic treatments to make their sons more appealing to Cleopatra's discerning eye. The selection process itself was legendary. Candidates had to pass through multiple stages of evaluation. First, they submitted poetry written in their own hand. Cleopatra insisted on intellectual compatibility. Then came physical assessments conducted by the queen's personal physicians. Finally, those who made it to the final round were invited to private dinners where Cleopatra would personally interview them, testing their wit, knowledge, and emotional maturity. The most shocking revelation comes from a papyrus fragment discovered in the Egyptian desert in 1922, but kept secret by archaeologists for decades due to its scandalous content. It describes in vivid detail what Cleopatra herself called her Garden of Adonis, a secret wing of her palace dedicated entirely to her romantic pursuits and pleasures. Picture this incredible scene. A series of luxuriously appointed rooms, each designed around different themes and fantasies. There was the Chamber of Isis, decorated with gold hieroglyphs and filled with sacred artifacts where Cleopatra would dress as the goddess of love and magic. The Room of Eternal Spring had living walls covered in flowering vines and a ceiling that opened to reveal the stars. The Hall of Mirrors was exactly what it sounds like. Polished bronze mirrors covering every surface, creating an infinity of reflections. In these magical spaces, carefully selected young men would compete in elaborate contests of wit, poetry, physical prowess, and artistic creativity. Winners earned the ultimate privilege of private audiences with the queen herself. But these weren't simple romantic encounters. They were elaborate theatrical performances where Cleopatra played different roles and created different scenarios. Sometimes she would dress as Isis, the goddess of love, fertility, and magic, complete with golden headdress and jeweled serpent armlets, and her chosen companion would play her divine consort in reenactments of ancient myths. Other times, she recreated famous mythological seductions, playing Helen of Troy, Aphrodite, or Hathor, always casting herself as the powerful goddess claiming her rightful prize. The Roman senator Cicero, in private letters that weren't discovered until centuries later, expressed absolute disgust and fascination with what he called Cleopatra's theater of flesh. He described scenes that made even battle-hardened Roman soldiers uncomfortable. Elaborate rituals involving music, dancing, exotic foods, and romantic encounters that lasted for days. Young men from noble families across the entire empire would compete desperately for invitations to Alexandria, knowing that one night with Cleopatra could secure their family's fortune for generations, but also knowing it could destroy their reputations and political careers forever if the wrong people found out. The queen had incredibly specific requirements for her companions. Physical beauty was just the starting point. They had to demonstrate exceptional intellectual capacity, being able to discuss philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, and poetry with equal skill. She would test them with complex riddles, challenging philosophical debates, and demand they compose original poetry on the spot. Only those who passed all her demanding tests earned access to the inner chambers of her Garden of Adonis. But perhaps most shocking of all was Cleopatra's record-keeping. Ancient sources mention detailed scrolls where she documented every encounter, rating her companions on various criteria and keeping track of their performances like a Roman general tracking his battles. Some historians believe these records were later used for political blackmail, ensuring the loyalty of powerful families whose sons had participated in her ceremonies. Cleopatra's obsession with youthful beauty and energy went far beyond mere physical attraction or political maneuvering. Ancient Egyptian sources suggest she genuinely believed that intimate contact with young men could transfer their life force and vitality to her, keeping her own beauty, power, and mental sharpness intact as she aged. This wasn't just vanity, it was ancient magic and medical theory combined. She consulted regularly with the high priests of various temples who taught her complex rituals that combined romance with Egyptian magic and Greek philosophy. These ceremonies often took place during specific lunar phases and involved elaborate preparations that could last for weeks. The queen would begin each ritual with purification ceremonies. She would bathe in milk mixed with honey, crushed pearls, and rose petals imported from the most expensive gardens in the empire. Her body would be anointed with oils made from rare plants and animal extracts that supposedly enhanced both beauty and sexual appeal. She wore specific jewelry designed by court magicians, rings with hidden compartments containing love potions, necklaces arranged in patterns that matched constellation maps, and crown pieces that incorporated actual meteorite fragments. The chambers would be prepared with mathematical precision. Incense burners were placed according to geometric formulas. Candles were lit in specific sequences, and even the food served followed ancient recipes designed to heighten desire and create mystical experiences. Musicians would play compositions written according to Pythagorean mathematical principles, believing that certain numerical ratios in music could influence human emotions and behavior. This elaborate practice continued even during her famous relationships with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. Historical accounts suggest that both Roman leaders were initially intrigued by Cleopatra's exotic customs, then gradually became disturbed and jealous of her parallel romantic pursuits with much younger men. Caesar, according to the historian Suetonius, once arrived unexpectedly at the palace and walked in on one of these elaborate ceremonies. He found Cleopatra dressed as the goddess Isis, surrounded by a group of young men engaged in what Roman sources describe as mystical and carnal rituals. Caesar was so shocked and offended by the scene that he immediately left Alexandria and didn't return for several weeks, causing a temporary diplomatic crisis. Mark Antony, being naturally more hedonistic and pleasure-seeking, initially participated enthusiastically in these festivities. Roman historians describe him joining Cleopatra's feasts and even helping her select new companions. But even the famously indulgent Antony eventually grew jealous and resentful of the attention Cleopatra lavished on her rotating collection of young favorites. Ancient letters describe heated arguments between Antony and Cleopatra about what he called her inappropriate diversions. He couldn't understand why the woman who claimed to love him continued to seek pleasure with others, especially men young enough to be their sons. These conflicts intensified as their political situation became more desperate and their relationship more strained. What do you think drove this seemingly insatiable obsession? Was it pure physical desire, a desperate attempt to maintain power through beauty and seduction, or something much deeper and more complex? The end of Cleopatra's Garden of Adonis came suddenly and dramatically. In 30 BC, as Octavian's Roman legions approached Alexandria and defeat became inevitable, Cleopatra made one final, desperate selection from her collection of young lovers. Ancient sources describe a last feast that was both celebration and funeral. The palace was decorated more elaborately than ever before, with golden decorations, the finest foods from across the empire, and entertainment that supposedly lasted for 3 days and nights. But everyone present knew this was goodbye forever. At this final ceremony, she chose her most beloved companion, a young Greek poet named Apollodorus who had served in her court for 3 years, and had become not just a lover, but a trusted confidant. Unlike the others who had been temporary pleasures, Apollodorus had earned a permanent place in both her bed and her inner circle of advisors. But this time, the encounter wasn't about pleasure or political maneuvering. In the privacy of her most sacred chamber, Cleopatra shared with Apollodorus her most closely guarded secrets, the location of treasure hoards hidden throughout Egypt, the names of loyal supporters who might continue resistance against Rome, and most importantly, the exact details of her planned suicide. Some historians believe she offered him the ultimate romantic gesture, the chance to die alongside her, united forever in death as they had been united in life. This wasn't just love, it was her final act of control, choosing who would share her fate and her eternal legacy. Apollodorus made the difficult choice to live rather than die, becoming one of the few people to escape Cleopatra's palace before it fell to Roman forces. His survival allowed him to preserve not just his own life, but also the intimate details of Cleopatra's private world that would otherwise have been lost forever. His surviving poems, discovered on papyrus fragments centuries later, provide our most authentic and intimate glimpse into what Cleopatra was really like behind the myths and Roman propaganda. In those verses, he describes her not as the manipulative seductress that Roman historians portrayed, but as a brilliant, complex woman, desperately trying to maintain control and dignity in a world dominated by men who wanted to use her for their own purposes. His most famous poem about her contains these haunting lines. She was not cruel, but hungry, not for flesh alone, but for the spark of life that only untainted youth could kindle in her ancient soul. She collected us like rare jewels, not for our beauty, but for the light we carried within us. Cleopatra's story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about power, desire, sexuality, and the double standards that have shaped how we judge historical figures for over 2,000 years. While male rulers like Julius Caesar and Mark Antony are celebrated and admired for their romantic conquests and sexual appetites, Cleopatra has been consistently vilified and demonized for pursuing her own desires on her own terms. Her fascination with youthful beauty and energy wasn't just personal preference or shallow vanity. It was a carefully calculated survival strategy designed to maintain power in a world where a woman's political influence was almost always tied to her ability to inspire passionate devotion and loyalty in men. Every carefully orchestrated encounter in her Garden of Adonis was simultaneously personal pleasure and sophisticated political maneuvering. Modern historians and archaeologists are beginning to reassess Cleopatra's legacy with fresh eyes, recognizing that her romantic choices, however shocking they may have seemed to ancient Roman sensibilities, actually represented a remarkable form of female empowerment that was almost unprecedented in the ancient world. She refused to be merely a prize to be won by powerful men seeking to control Egypt's wealth. Instead, she made herself the ultimate prize that others competed desperately to achieve. The most fascinating aspect of her story is how well she understood that in her historical moment, romance and sexuality were just another form of warfare, and she was determined to win every single battle. Her Garden of Adonis wasn't just about satisfying physical desires. It was about creating a vast network of devoted young men who would carry her influence, her memory, and her legend throughout the Mediterranean world long after her death. Even after she was gone, these men spread stories of her incredible wisdom, devastating beauty, and overwhelming personal power, creating the mythical reputation that survives today. In a very real way, her romantic strategy achieved a form of immortality that military conquest or political maneuvering never could have provided. The next time you hear about Cleopatra's legendary beauty and seductive powers, remember that behind the myth was a brilliant woman who understood that romance, when wielded skillfully and strategically, could be the most powerful and lasting weapon of all. What do you think about Cleopatra's approach to romance and power? Was she a victim of her historical circumstances, or a master manipulator who played by her own rules and won? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more shocking secrets from ancient history that will completely change how you see the past forever.